Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Now, this is the second afternoon of our forum, and some of you might be feeling a little bit jet-lagged and a little bit tired. I'm not going to make you jump up and down and start dancing around, but we have got a really important session now, and this sort of gets to the heart of how can we actually get more productivity into really important sectors, get greater value for farmers, get greater value for the countries from their productive sectors. So we're going to be looking at strengthening inclusive agribusiness for export growth, very much looking at the export market here, but I'm sure that we'll have some impacts on the domestic side as well. So we'll be looking at opportunities and challenges, how we can support inclusive and sustainable agribusiness and their value chains, and we'll be showcasing examples of successes across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. I think many of you would have been here this morning where we saw some really exciting examples of innovations and trade that is going across different countries and trading geographically, regionally, and globally. I'm going to hand over to your moderator for this session, which is Simon Hess from the Enhanced Integrated Framework Secretariat. Simon's the focal point in EIF for thematic issues related to the 2030 agenda. So Simon, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming through here this afternoon. As Sarah mentioned, this area of agribusiness really cuts to the heart of the EIF. In fact, when you look at the total demand for projects submitted to the EIF Trust Fund, around 2/3 of these projects are in the area of agribusiness or related areas. So this really demonstrates the level of interest as well as of potential for development through this sector in the LDCs. This session is really going to be very practical. We'll hear from and discuss with the leaders and innovators in the area of agribusiness and trade. And by the time we leave this room, we should all have new ideas and inspiration on what opportunities exist for adding value through agribusiness and how we can scale this up for impact. I'm pleased to be joined by a really fantastic panel here today, each with a unique view on what it takes for inclusive agribusiness to flourish. The Body Shop is a household name across the world. And did you know that EIF supporters in Samoa, the Women in Business Development Incorporated, WIBD, supply key ingredients for this global brand's products? We're very pleased to have Heather Ducharme with us, a Sustainable Sourcing Manager at the Body Shop, who will tell us more about this initiative and the trade links from the Body Shop to organizations like WIBD. Prior to working in the private sector, Heather also held positions in the Canadian government as well as civil society. Turning to the end of the panel there, Ms. Trish Kabi is a small business owner and an agripreneur who has really leveraged the investment from an EIF-funded project implemented through ITC in Lesotho. Trish is the Executive Director of Alosang Enterprise, a company that she has built up with her background in economics, accounting, and business leadership. She has numerous accolades, including being named Lesotho's leading woman entrepreneur, and a strong passion for economic development and empowerment of the people of Lesotho. Monsieur Saïd Salime est le coordinateur national de l'unité nationale de mise en œuvre du cadre intégré renforcé aux Comores. En plus, au cours de sa carrière, il devient secrétaire général de la Chambre de commerce, secrétaire général au ministère de l'économie et du commerce et de l'industrie. And right in the middle of the panel, we have the World Bank to talk about scale. And very pleased to have Stephen Dimitriyev, the World Bank's lead private sector specialist for Tanzania, Burundi, Malawi, and Somalia. He also oversees the regional programs for the World Bank in trade and private sector development. In addition to all of this, Steve is the current EIF donor facilitator in Tanzania as well. So it's a rather large topic that we've got today. So I'd like to start off this panel maybe with you, Rob, who's the chief of the Sector and Enterprise Competitiveness section at the International Trade Center, the ITC, where he leads, amongst other areas, the Value Added to Trade program. And prior to joining ITC, Rob managed private sector development initiatives for large international consulting firms. So, Rob, in painting the picture for the session today, when we speak about adding value, what are we really speaking about? And how can countries use these concepts to grow successful agribusiness?
Thanks, Simon. And thanks, well, first of all, thanks for inviting us. Also, thanks for all the collaboration on the EIF. So I think ITC, we've had the best job, which is we get to focus on the projects, we get to focus on products and thinking about generating value. Well, you're helping put together the projects and doing a lot of work to bring them together. So thanks for the collaboration. Thanks again for having us. So I want to just paint a picture in a couple of ways. I love the topic, but we got to be relatively short on it. When we talk about value, we are increasingly trying to talk about it in a nuanced way, because a lot of people think more value must mean more processing. And what has kind of driven our work is more to have a nuanced view of different kinds of value. So, for instance, for farmers, in many cases, the most value they can gain immediately is less waste. So that's not immediately processing. So there's many different kinds of value, and a lot of our work has been with countries in determining these different types. So it starts off maybe with reducing waste, improving efficiency, reducing cost, and it moves through different aspects of the supply chain, taking on more tasks within the supply chain. So taking on board distribution, taking on board processing, taking on board exporting. It goes to moving up the chain. So in a way, adding value through processing, adding value through moving to different product areas. For instance, from a fresh product to a mixed, sliced, packaged product. And it also, value to us has a fifth element, and this is distribution or inclusion value. So there's a lot more value to a country of a unit that is distributed widely and that can feed a lot of investment than a dollar that is not distributed widely. So we like to look at value across all those areas, and I think the important thing in a conversation like this is to have that nuance, and also to have data that drives our decisions about what kind of value we're targeting. The second thing I would say is that in my mind, there's kind of three concentric circles around how we do this work. The first one and the outermost is with the customer, and that's where that determines the value. So if people don't want the product, you can't sell it. Sounds obvious, but we have this conversation a lot with folks. So it's really that relationship and holding that relationship with the customer that determines a lot of the value. And so some of our work is around building the relationship between exporters and the customers, whether it's a business customer or whether it's a final consumer. And a lot of our customers are business consumers like Body Shop or others. So developing that relationship. A second element of building value for us, and probably the most important, is building the ecosystem around the SMEs and around the actors in the value chain to put in place all the elements necessary to generate more value and to do so at scale. So here, my colleagues have developed an approach called Alliances for Action, which I'll describe, not because I want to sell a branded product, but I think it drives a lot of these questions around scale and having holistic approaches. These are very market-led alliances between private sector, so those in destination markets, those in local markets, along with government, along with all the other actors in the chain, input suppliers, farmer groups, farmers themselves, and other actors around it. So these alliances are built in a very open way, and everybody in the alliance needs to bring something to it. The exporter, the buyer or the importer, the farmer groups, government, and so on. Building these alliances and building this ecosystem is the key to creating the ownership and the engagement that really is in evidence in projects that work and where we see actual value generated. I'm going to dwell on a couple of lessons we've learned there because I think they'll come out in the rest of the panel. Number one is they've got to be market-led. And I only say this because although we talk about it, we don't always do it in our work. So somebody's got to be out there, and we've got to have companies who are buying, and we've got to have the local private sector very much involved for this to, for us to be able to generate value. If they don't generate value, we don't achieve our development results. For instance, our research indicates if they're not making money, if they're not competitive, they're not going to invest in sustainability. So it's creating these alliances, co-creating, co-leading, and having them be very open so that these different actors can work together and take the alliance where it needs to go. This is not always easy also in a very strict and rigid environment that we have in our projects sometimes. So market-led, strong private sector engagement, and I would say on the panel we've got two examples of what that looks like. A strong engagement of a buyer in Body Shop and a strong engagement of a local private sector actor in Trish Kabi. You also need time and money to make these alliances work. That looks like overhead in many cases, but it requires a lot of effort to continue to build trust and to have people work together. And this is something that that we can't emphasize enough. So this is to provide some oxygen for local actors to work together to build a shared program to generate value. And the last thing is that I think we have to have a short-term and a long-term vision in these alliances. We can't say, look, we're going to give you something in 10 years where you're going to have a really high-value product. In many cases, short-term, we're talking about efficiency, we're talking about a couple of cents on the dollar, and long-term, we're talking about transformational change. So that's building. So I talked about the customer perception, which determines the value, building this ecosystem, which enables it. And then 80% of our work, which I'm not going to go in too deeply here, is it's the capabilities of the actors in the value chain. So there's a lot of hard work with small companies, with farmer groups, with government institutions and others, to build their capabilities to actually execute. So this is where the value is actually generated in these companies, and in this day-to-day work. So if we get, all we have to do is get those things right. Okay, that sounds easy. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and I think we'll see more here. And these are generally EIF examples. So for instance, when I talk about changing the perception of value with the customer, we did some work with Senegal under EIF to position a fresh Senegalese mango as a premium product in markets. So this is really changing the mind of the consumer and increasing their perception of value of this quality product. So this is the kind of thing we do with customers, and a lot of that work is also with buyers. So it's not necessarily with consumers, but it's helping buyers understand the value of the product. With the ecosystem work under the EIF, a lot of countries have worked with us to develop export strategies. And this is not a document. What it is a process to bring these people together around alliances. An example, for instance, is it wasn't a big project. In Burkina Faso, created an export strategy for shea, and it's actually been a great way to leverage additional resources. And the SME work ranges a lot. So I'll give an example. I think in the Comores, SME we define very broadly. There we've been working with farmer groups, farmer cooperatives, as a kind of company to operate on a business-like fashion. So to get formalized, to understand value, to help their producers improve quality. So these are the kinds of things I think we'll hear more about in the cases, Those are when we see real value generated, when we see scale, when we see a good dynamic, it's because all of these things are somehow in place and they've been thought about. And in particular, that we've had good private sector engagement and there's a good market dynamic to it. It's commercial. So when I enter a country, I usually ask, is anybody making any money? People are usually pretty scared when I ask that. I want to end with a couple of cases where I think it's really happened or it's happening under EIF, where we're seeing scale, where EIF is having that catalytic effect. Probably our biggest star is Gambia. So we did an EIF project there with export strategies and with bringing people together around 3 commodities: sesame, groundnut, and cashew. And this work around that and creating a quality culture in those value chains has been the basis for a lot of the technical work we're now doing under a very large EU project. And it's a lot of those relationships that are really making that effective. In Senegal, we've worked under the EIF in mango, as I mentioned. And what that's really done is it's been the government of Senegal having a long-term vision and carrying that vision across multiple projects. EIF, funding from the Netherlands, their own government funding, and now an EU project. So there's really a long-term vision there and a lot of leverage. And I come back to the Burkina case because it's a very small intervention in terms of budget, but it's actually generated, so this was basically finding a way to retain more of the value of shea processing in Burkina rather than transferring to Ghana and elsewhere. And in fact, this is leveraged, the whole process, the good planning, the bringing the sector together has now leveraged a project of $1 million or more to do the execution. So these are, I mean, this is kind of the effect that I think you're trying to have. All of them are going to take time to really realize. And there's a couple that are at this panel that are at the tipping point of what could be, you know, a great takeoff. And those are Lesotho, where we worked a lot to help organize to help Lesotho organize and improve the capital infrastructure around horticulture, and to build a shared use facility or to renovate it. And the question is, now, is it going to take the next step and really build a dynamic across the sector? And I think Trish is going to give us the answer on that one. And the Comoros, there's been some really interesting stuff done with farmer groups, obtaining finance for them, improving quality, building the infrastructure for processing of ylang-ylang and other commodities. So the next step is all this going to take, and is there going to be a self-propelling dynamic there? And we've got Saïd to talk to us about that case. So with, I hope that wasn't too long. Let me hand it back to you, Simon, and happy to answer any questions on those.
Thank you very much, Rob. You gave us a fantastic overview and picture of value addition. I think that sets the scene very nicely. One of the aspects that you brought out is that in all these initiatives, we need to have a market-led approach. And I think that leads in very nicely to Heather, who obviously working from the body shop side, it works together with WIBD and Samoa, as well as with scores of other producers across the world. So Heather, what has your experience been in here? How does the body shop work with suppliers like WIBD? And what advice do you have for people in the room on how to connect to organizations like yourself?
Great, thanks. Thanks, Simon. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope this finds you all awake and well. I'll try to be interesting. So it's a hard time of day this time of day. So I first of all want to just introduce our company very briefly for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The Body Shop International is a cosmetics company. We sell moisturizers, lotions, skincare products, shampoos, soap, that sort of thing. It's been in existence. It was founded by a woman called Anita Roddick in the UK about 40 years ago. It was groundbreaking at the time because it was woman-led business led by a woman who really believed in business as a force for good and creating positive social change through your business activities, through trade. And one of Anita Roddick's brainchilds that started 30 years ago is a program called Community Trade. It's now called Community Trade. It was originally called Trade Not Aid. And the whole point of it and the whole purpose of it was a private sector-led development initiative, if you will. But with a clear difference in the mind of Anita Roddick and still in our minds, which is that it's about trade between equals. It's about trading partnerships. It's not, I've just lost my microphone, my earphone. It's not a donation, it's not a charity project, it's not corporate social responsibility, it's actually creating positive social and environmental change through trade. I can't emphasize that enough because I think it gets quite mixed up in the corporate world, actually, the differences between those. So the Community Trade Program, which you'll see, yes, behind me, fantastic. It's grown a great deal. It started 31 years ago this year, in 1987, with a single handicraft producer in South India that we still trade with. 30 years later, we are trading with the same group called Teddy Exports, and we still sell their products in our stores. They make wooden products, massage products. They're part of our accessories portfolio. But it has grown from Teddy Exports in India to a portfolio of supply chains that's now 31 suppliers from 23 different countries in the world, which you can see behind me. Most of those are ingredients, so they're agricultural products, some wild harvested, so biodiversity products, ingredients that we include in our bath and body, our moisturizers, our lotions, etc. So as you heard already, we source coconut oil, organic virgin coconut oil, not just any coconut oil, from Samoa. As you can see in the corner of the map, and it is actually in this map, Alberta, it actually says Samoa. So we clearly do acknowledge and recognize that's our single source of organic virgin coconut oil for our lead coconut oil range. So it's quite a big program now. I think in terms of the questions here, first of all, I'll tell you briefly the sort of what makes this program different in terms of the supply chain structure is that we have explicit commitments to the producers, to the producer groups in our supply chains. We have total visibility, first of all. We know where our stuff comes from, which is quite unusual, believe it or not, in cosmetic supply chains and probably other supply chains for international businesses. For these 31 supply chains, we know exactly where our ingredients and our accessories and gifts come from, and people in my company go and visit these people on a regular basis to actually meet them and find out what's going on in their communities and work with them over time to enhance their capabilities and enhance the trade that we have with them. And this comes within a very clear structure of commitments. So we have commitments to fair pricing. We have commitments to what we call a sustainable business level, which is a demand target, that the Body Shop has a target for ourselves of how much we will buy from these producers, and we measure ourselves against this. We also have what we call a penetration rate target, which is we don't actually want to overbuy from the producers, and so that they don't become excessively dependent on what could be a volatile demand from us. There's other commitments we have. We sometimes fund community projects, usually through a price mechanism similar to fair trade, and so on. And these are all public commitments that we make through something we call now our Sustainable Sourcing Charter. We have dedicated staff who work with, as I've already mentioned. And yeah, I mean, it's quite an established program, and I think it's probably I'd be hard pressed to say it's unique in the world of business, but I think it's probably one of the first private sector-led development programs like this, and probably the oldest. And we have learned quite a bit. And so I think I'll talk very briefly about the things that we have learned over 30 years of doing this in terms of value addition, and it will reflect, I think, in practical terms, a lot of what you've just said, Rob. The things I'm recognizing, nodding my head as you were talking about. It must be market-led. I sit in a buying position in the company, but I have to interact with our marketing team. So whenever we're looking at our community trade ingredients and how much we buy and how much we have to look at how much we can sell and how much I can sell into the business, and whether that particular ingredient, that particular producer group has an appeal to our customers. cosmetic customers are mostly women. We have 3,000 stores around the world, so there's quite a large variety of people who go in our stores, but we have to appeal to those customers. And the cosmetic trends change. So we think about our markets, and then we have to somehow translate that into meeting our demand targets from the producers. So whenever I'm looking for new community trade ingredients, or whenever we have to always consider, okay, does this fit our product offer? Are consumers going to buy this? And sometimes you might have an absolutely beautiful ingredient from a lovely place, produced by amazing people of good quality, and it's not what our customers want to buy. So it's this kind of fine art of balancing what's available and what you want to do with your trade and the positive impacts you want to drive, and also what the market will bear. So it's, I think, understanding the buyer, for us to understand our consumers, but for our producer groups to really understand Body Shop as a cosmetic company who has to meet certain cosmetic trends, who makes bath and body products, cosmetic products for a particular kind of market. It's really helpful for us when we're all thinking about who the end buyer is, because they're the people who are funding the rest of the supply chain, basically. So think about the buyer. Be market-led as much as you can. I'm sure you're well aware from the positions and expertise in your organizations that if you don't have a buyer, or you produce without a buyer, then it's a waste of time. So anyway, I would also say the other big lesson that we have learned is I've already mentioned it briefly, but dependency. Never stop at one buyer. If you do manage to obtain a good contract with an international buyer, or even good stability with local buyers, keep diversifying and keep looking for new customers, because I have seen firsthand, it's unfortunately not in our coconut oil supply chain, but in one of our other supply chains, where there was volatility in Body Shop demand, and it really is devastating at the producer level. So it is when the dependency is too high. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm happy to explain it some more, but basically, if a producer group relies on us as a single customer, then they can be in trouble. So those were sort of two key lessons learned. There was one other thing that popped out for me. In terms of value add, I would say, I would again reflect Rob's comments. The value for us as a business of community trade is multiple. It is, yes, we want a good quality ingredient that fulfills cosmetic function in our products. We also want sustainability. We also want the story of what's happening at the community level. And so the sustainability proposition, what's happening environmentally, what's happening socially, what's happening in the community, is very valuable to the Body Shop. So understanding it's not just making cosmetic products yourselves, for example, or being a processor yourself. There's value in how you tell your story of your product. And that can be very valuable particularly to a brand-led, retail-facing kind of company like ours. I'm probably going on too long, but I'll stop there.
Heather, I think that was amazing. It was really interesting. Again, looking at the market led and taking that up again to the customers, and we'll have opportunities for comments and questions from the floor after a little while. So I'm sure there'll be more opportunity to explore these areas in detail. So I urge you now to start thinking quite specifically about what you would like to speak more to Heather about, or to Rob, or the other panelists. I'd like to now turn to Ms. Trish Kabi, who, from employing just 4 staff a few years ago, now has more than 50 people employed through Alosang Enterprise. So this really is an example of a successful agribusiness. And so, Trish, I'd like to invite you up to maybe speak to us and ask you in particular what factors have been key to your success, and could this be the start of an agribusiness revolution in Lesotho?
Thank you, Moderator. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. May I start off by firstly expressing our heartfelt appreciation to EIF and the donor funding community that is supporting the LDCs in order for us to advance and address our economic factors that are limiting our trade. Perhaps it would help to give an indication of where Lesotho is located in Africa so that it will clearly show the kind of challenges that we're confronted with, as well as the opportunities that we took advantage of. Lesotho is a small country in the southern part of Africa, a country inside another country. We are totally surrounded by South Africa. When we first started in 2013, through the intervention of EIF, like I've already said, through horticulture, we started with producing in the, let me just see, in the, sorry, I'm trying, okay. In the greenhouse, oh, the same slide, please, the first one. The greenhouse at the top there, that's where we started. It's the size of 15 by 8. And it was that donated through the EIF project. We were one of the first beneficiaries. And then the capacity thereof takes about that, and the net takes about 900 seedlings. We started off with tomato and peppers. So that was 2013, 2014, when we started with 4,000 staff component. In the following year, we expanded operations, and we operated from 5,000 seedlings. And then we went to financial institutions. And I should make mention that we have cross-cutting challenges as LDCs. Access to finance was a huge impediment on our side. Nonetheless, we overcame that challenge by seeding almost all of our other properties, to an extent that we expanded our operations in year 2 from employment of the 4 permanent staff to engaging 24, both combination of permanent and contract staff. And our productivity increased from 5,000 seedlings to 20,000 seedlings of tomato and pepper combined. These being our cash crops that we're focusing on in order to optimize on the aerospace. Because one seedling of tomato produces approximately between 15 kg to 20 kgs, depending on the cultivar that we're planting. So that process enables us to have longer planting seasons. Currently, if we look at the slide up there, at the other top right, at the other top picture, that is where we currently status currently. We're having a staff component of 50, between 50 and 80, depending on the activities that are prevailing at any point in time. So we producing at the capacity of 50,000 seedlings of tomato and peppers combined. We have taken the initiative further to expand our operations, not only to be limited to production, cultivation only. We also advanced and developed a pack house where we also doing packaging of the products that we harvest, agro processing, packing them up and supplying them to the market as ready-to-eat packages. And we are now in the process of further diversification into producing frozen vegetables. That aspect of the operation is currently missing some of the linkages within the value chain, which we hope we will overcome in the medium to long term. When we look at Lesotho currently, I have just indicated where we are from, where we are currently. I'd also like to indicate the opportunities that we have. Almost all of our land is 3,000 feet above sea level. That placing us at an altitude that is very suitable for deciduous fruits and growth of these kind of crops without having to encounter many types of diseases, which enables us to say it would be easy in our environment to have organic production. Having said that, at the bottom here is a map of Lesotho, and the orange area, that's the suitability map that was done by the World Bank through the private sector competitiveness to identify areas that are suitable for the deciduous fruits production. So we also are blessed in the sense that we have water in abundance. Natural water is one of our most common resources. So that also is an enabling factor for this type of project to thrive in our country. I'd now like to also indicate that the future, what we envisage or what we'd want to see as an enabler to overcome some of our constraints as a country is to venture into coupling horticulture with the plantation of pecan nut trees. We believe with this will leapfrog us and create a sustainable economy because these trees have a long shelf life. And once they've started to produce, it can create opportunity for us to export to the international market. So that is an area of intervention to which we're looking at. And fortunate for us, our country, the policy framework in the country is supportive of this environment. The current national development strategy that we're currently working on is looking at agriculture as one of the enabling sectors to enhance our economy. So some of these issues, and the current national budget has incorporated agriculture and in particular deciduous fruits and horticulture as a key focus point. Ladies and gentlemen, as Alosang Enterprise, what we'd want to see, I have already indicated to EIF that what we'd want to see is the initiatives that we took as Alosang, a small entity that started from nowhere, but is gradually now in the crawling process. We believe that this can easily be replicated throughout a small country. And in so doing, it will enable us to advance our economy, address our economic challenges such as poverty, and create jobs for our women and youth, in addition to enabling, giving us the possibility of expanding and exporting our products to the international market. May we move to the next slide? Ladies and gentlemen, this is how we took advantage of our operations along the value chain. What you see there is the value chain process of business A, which is basically the cultivation, the farming aspect of the business, and business B, which is the processing, packaging, and possibility of that extension, the diversification that I've just spoken about. So the two entities, we refer to them as the farming entity and the pack house processing and packaging. These two aspects share our resources, and that is where we leverage on reducing our overheads in order to optimize our operations so that at the end of the day, we improve effectiveness and efficiency in our production. Thank you. We are very strongly advocating for private sector development. Most of the developing countries are confronted with the challenge of government-led initiatives. What we'd want to see is to have a vibrant private sector that will lead the economy of the country out of the constraints that I've indicated that we're confronted with of poverty, reduction, unemployment, so that we can be able to sustain our economy. It is going to help in the sense that we will leave the dependency syndrome that we seem to have and be able to sustain our economy as a country by ensuring that all the relevant key players we take an integrated approach to the entire value chain process. We have indicated at the top that the regulatory bodies should focus on an enabling environment, policy making, not become part of the value chain processes in the production that will culminate at the end of the day in the trade export that we all seek to do. Having said that, I would like to say to us today that this is a defining moment for Africa. And all of us gathered here today, we have an opportunity to take in order to make sure that we leave a legacy of Africans and future generations that will benefit from sustainable economic projects that we should initiate from this discussion. The market for us is vibrant. When we first started, we were supplying only the value chain, the chain stores in Maseru. We expanded our operations to include hotels. Currently, we are supplying 2 of the major mines in the country with our produce. And we believe that with a network, if we could replicate what Alosang is doing in 10 of our districts, I'm sure that that would definitely be an advancement of our economy. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Trish. I think it's really an inspiration to us all what you've done, and we look forward to hopefully in a couple of years' time listening to how this has really scaled up and replicated, as you mentioned, across the other districts in the country and with many more businesses like you. I'd like to maybe take a little pause here and show you a film that we've developed in Malawi. This is the first time that we're showing this film, done by an excellent communications team in the EIF, and I think it gives a really good snapshot again of what's happening in agribusiness. We heard earlier as well about NASFAM in the Dragon's Den, and so right now I think it's just an opportunity to get a bit more of a picture. After the film, I'll turn to Betty to see if she would like to add any more onto what has been shown here, and then also open the floor to a couple of questions before we then move on to the other panelists. So thank you. Is the film ready?
Sinanga ndine Vesta Johnson. Ndine mulimi wa soya. Nalibe nyumba, nabanga nyumba. Sinima kwanisa wasamalira buno bwino nimbe uzanga za kunyumba. Ananga analiba mpawi, ulimi uyuyu kumudzi kwathu. Ndinala anthu otsalira mamvuli. Koma atatirana kuno kuti kuli nasipamu. Koma nitamba nasipamu ni pamene naona kuti ni bwino ni phindu la bwino.
Is one of the 6,500 farmers that we have been working with since 2014. My name is Betty Chinyamunyamu. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the National Smallholder Farmers Association of Malawi. The project has been helping farmers like Betsa to improve their livelihood, specifically by helping them produce a better crop and also link them to markets. So this project is empowering over 3,000 women, and we've seen tangible results from improvements in the yields, doubling or more than doubling. We've also seen them accessing good markets. The quality of the soya was so good that they're able to sell even to export markets. And that is a really good thing because you can see regional integration is coming in here, and also ultimately the farmer is getting a good price. So in addition to this project, we have a processing facility, and this is where we process all the products that the farmers produce on the farm for both the local market and also the export markets. We're also employing many women, so it is a much bigger picture. It's not just about helping a farmer get a better livelihood, but it is also contributing to Malawi's economic growth.
My feeling is that we are making progress. My name is Christina Chatima. I'm the director responsible for trade in Malawi. We are very happy that we're in a partnership with NASFAM to achieve the implementation of the National Export Strategy as well as the government agenda in terms of poverty reduction. So this partnership with the EIF has had a very big impact in Malawi in terms of opening markets as well as enhancing our productive capacity. We are trying to industrialize. We are adding value to get more foreign exchange from what we produce for export. And that is exactly what is happening. And the good thing with the farming project is it has supported quite a number of smallholder farmers, and most of them, they are women entrepreneurs.
Umoyo wanga ine unasinchika ninasipa umene nali nalowayi zambiri nasintha umoyo wanga tumapeza bobe phindu labwino chifukwa masamalira ana anga aja pachaka china chilichonse ndimathawa kugula zovala kusika madyetsera bwino pa khomo maphindu ene imene napezapo ni nyumba nakumbisa njerwa ndikutentesa ndikukhoma malata pamwamba mazina zisinamalizise bwino umoyo wanga lili bwino kwambiri.
Thank you. Really, this has been a phenomenally successful project in the EIF, and I think demonstrates what has been shared already in terms of adding value at different stages. So in the project, NASFAM is looking at adding value to farmers in increased prices for their crops, so looking at producing seed crops, as well as fetch a higher price in the market, looking at diversification, getting higher value markets and exports into the region, as well as international branding, owning brands, co-owning brands with others in international markets. Betty, I'd like to open the floor up to you. You can speak from where you are. And be very interested to hear your perspective about agribusiness and what countries and organizations like yourselves are doing to add value for smallholder farmers.
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to just talk about inclusive agribusiness. And specifically, I know for most developing countries, women take a big part in agricultural production. However, they are left out when it comes to markets or processing. So the products that we are working with are products that traditionally, I think I should say, maybe just as in many countries, we have some crops that are commonly referred to as male crops and others that are female crops. And usually it's food crops that are referred to as female crops. And cash crops would be referred to as male crops, meaning it's men who are involved in the production of those crops. So in our case, this film is showing soya. This morning I was talking about groundnuts. The project was dealing with both crops, but both of those crops were crops that traditionally were female crops. And the reason they were female crops is because they didn't have good markets. If farmers were producing them, they didn't have a good market to sell them compared to tobacco, which is predominantly a male crop. But with this project now, we have seen many women being empowered. And the first thing that you see is for such interventions like ours, where we ask people to join, it will be firstly female-headed households that come up because they don't have many other options for looking after their families. They don't have a man in the house who is producing another cash crop. So And then the other interesting thing is that when these female-headed households come, they are very focused in terms of wanting value from the intervention. So every time you're working with them, they're asking, what am I going to get out of this? And if it's not giving them value, they will leave. When it gives them value, like you've seen in this film, it means everything. And even for people who we are supporting them to find markets, for us, it can be just statistics. We are producing so much. We exported so much soya to this country. But when you consider what that means for the one farmer or for the two farmers whose lives change forever, that feeling is something that you really cannot put value to. So I just wanted to say that when we talk about these things, yes, it's business. It's about money. But more importantly, it's about giving hope to somebody through business that perhaps didn't have hope. So I just wanted to add that perspective, that there's a human face to this agribusiness that we're talking about, and that the farmer themselves, whether they're male or female, they are business people. They want value as well. And if we can give them that, then we are going to move together. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. You've raised the point particularly of inclusive agribusiness, and this is precisely, I think, where the added value of this sector is. You have the opportunity really to make an impact on people's lives, on those women in Malawi and other countries. So thank you. I will turn to the floor now just to get one or two questions. I'd also like to speak to the people that are following us over the internet. This session is being live streamed. They've sent through messages on Twitter to hashtag EIF Global Forum 2018 and hashtag Inclusive Trade for LDCs. And we're receiving comments as well from them. So if you are listening via the web stream as well, please do also free to send through your comments and questions to us here as well. So before we continue with our panel, I'd like to just see if there are one or two questions or comments from the floor that you'd like to raise. Okay, thank you. Yeah, Ambassador.
Thank you, Simon. This morning, when we were discussing the free trade area in Africa, I think one of the challenges that came or that was identified regarding promoting regional trade in Africa was the issue of logistics and infrastructure. Now, when we look at that constraint, though it may have been in the context of regional trade or continental trade, how these alliances that we've talked about, these alliances that have produced some of these positive results, have they faced logistical challenges? And if so, how have these logistical challenges been addressed? Just to put it in the context of, because what I see here is that this is mainly trade that may go beyond just the continent, beyond the continent, but all about within the continent, what are the prospects also for promoting that type of trade based on these productive alliances in the context of Africa regional integration. Thank you.
Yes, Muhammad Yassin, University of Udine, Italy. Just curiosity, I didn't know that there was gender bias in the product, so female crops and male crops, but that is funny. I see that women are basically one of the most engaged farmers in African reality. Though this exercise, we cannot define it as male or female exercise. So putting the human face in the business is good result. But as characteristics of the agricultural farming, the size of the farms and the size of the farmers is basically family farmers, small scale. So in order to be oriented towards exportation, they will face huge barriers of quantity rather than in addition to the quality. So what forms of, are there any forms of cooperatives or aggregation in order just to make economy of scale, in order also to penetrate export markets? And what are the also the challenges in terms also of the currency? Because this is also when they sell and buy, they use the African local currencies, and when they go to international markets, they will face the challenge with the hard currencies. So how this will be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you very much for both the questions. I'm going to turn back to the panel now and also read out a question that we've received online that's addressed specifically for Trish. The question was, where are you sourcing your seeds from? And does the producer or the region provide specific training for new varieties? And have there been varieties of seed that you have used or that you have wanted to use, however, been hindered by import regulations? And how does that affect your business? So maybe we can start with that last question directly to Trish, and then I'll turn to the panel for your responses to the first two questions, one on the challenges and prospects for trade in Africa, and the other on the looking at economies of scale and the challenge of currencies. Trish, over to you.
Thank you. When we first started in 2013, we sourced both locally in Lesotho as well as the neighboring country, obviously South Africa. The part of our business is as a form of research as well, to identify those cultivars of seeds that grow well in our area, that can be able to stand the climatic change of Lesotho. In the first year, we sourced both locally and South African, but we realized the challenge that this is a fairly new area in our country, I should say, horticulture. Most of the farming in that regard has always been on a subsistence level. It is only now that we're trying to commercialize. So seed production is an area that is not even tapped in our country. So hence why we sourced from South Africa. We identified 2 nurseries that we're sourcing from, so that would also compare the product conditions. In addition to that, we're trying to meet the global gap standards, because that's part of the requirement for some of our suppliers. So with such kind of nurseries, they're able to provide certificates for the product that we getting from them. And we're currently confronted with an availability of a standards bureau in Lesotho. So hence why we rely on South Africa for such kind of service. Insofar as training is concerned, the Ministry of Agriculture has taken on an initiative to try and see if they can consider that seed production, or actually seedling production, as an area also for intervention along the value chain. But like I said earlier, it's still within government. That is an initiative that should be taken by the private sector. So that also creates an opportunity for economic vibrancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish. I'd like to see if somebody on the panel would like to tackle the question raised on the challenges and prospects for trade in Africa, looking at infrastructure or other opportunities, hindrances that might be there. Rob? Heather?
Just a few brief comments from our own experience with the community trade supply chains originating in Africa. So we source ingredients from Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, Namibia, and Morocco. So a number of African countries. And I would say there are logistical and infrastructure challenges. I don't think the Body Shop as a company is well equipped to support on infrastructure challenges. So things like quality of roads or sort of public infrastructure. This is something we would probably hope and expect that the World Banks of the world and so on would be able to contribute to that. But in terms of logistical challenges, and by that I'm thinking specifically getting crop from A to B, moving it in a way that is efficient enough to not distort the price beyond our affordability and so on. The way our community trade supply chains are set up are often depend on intermediaries. So we have a producer group, a cooperative in some cases at origin, and they may do local aggregation from a group of small farmers or small collectors and some primary processing at that level. And then we actually typically don't contract directly with the producer group. We will have a contractual arrangement with an intermediary company. And that is often a company that will buy the aggregated crop or the primary processed product from the local group in Africa, and then they will take over at that point the shipping, the transporting, and the making sure it arrives in a refined, sometimes refining at our European factories, because most of our factories are based in Europe. I'm afraid to say at the moment that's the case for our company. So we typically have these intermediary companies for ingredient supply chains. It's not the case so much for our accessories. So a wooden handicraft might be a finished product, and the shipping may be done directly to our company, but and it's increasingly we're actually demanding of our intermediaries not just to do the logistical steps of it, but actually to provide direct support to the producer groups on building their capacity. And so teaching and training and educating. I think that we do have a view, I've seen it in, not the majority, but in a couple of our supply chains, where the producer groups have gradually, effectively grown to take over those functions. One particularly in Latin America, where effectively the producer group has expanded into its own intermediary, a separate company that does the shipping and producing. So it's possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. I'd actually like to propose that the question on scale actually come in a little bit later, because when we turn to Stephen from the World Bank, it's actually going to be one of the areas that I think he's going to raise with us now. Mais donc, savez-vous que le Comore produit plus de 50% de l'offre mondiale en yang-yang? Cependant, le défi pour le pays est maintenant de trouver de la valeur ajoutée. Saïd, pouvez-vous nous en dire plus de les initiatives entreprises par les Comores pour soutenir la croissance et la valeur ajoutée du yang-yang, ainsi que la vanille et du clou de giroflée? Merci.
Merci Simon. En effet, les Comores occupent 60% du marché mondial d'une essence extraite d'une fleur qui s'appelle l'ilang-ilang. Et nous l'exportons, donc occupons 60% de ce marché. Notre démarche en tant que CIR en ce moment, c'est d'appuyer un certain nombre d'initiatives, d'ailleurs portées essentiellement par des jeunes femmes et hautement qualifiées. Et elles ont en moyenne un niveau master. Donc, c'est des femmes hautement qualifiées et leur démarche consiste à ajouter de la valeur à ces trois produits. Pour le cas de l'ilang, c'est de les transformer et de les mettre en conditionnement, en packaging, qui leur permet de les vendre à la fois sur le marché domestique, sur le marché régional et sur le marché international. Et notre appui a consisté effectivement à les appuyer par rapport au packaging, à la certification et à l'enregistrement au niveau de la propriété intellectuelle. Nous en sommes très satisfaits parce que ces appuis ont été déclencheurs de véritables succès, puisque les acheteurs potentiels, une fois qu'ils ont été assurés que la certification est là, que le packaging qu'on a appuyé est parfait, que l'enregistrement auprès, par exemple, de l'OAPI, l'Organisation africaine de la propriété intellectuelle, est acquise et éprouvée, nos bénéficiaires ont été quasiment débordés par la demande, au point qu'on était même obligé de venir en aide très urgente par rapport à des commandes qui arrivaient par bateau, alors que la demande était là, assez importante. On a fait même venir effectivement des packaging très vite par avion pour qu'ils ne perdent pas leurs clients potentiels en Europe, dans la région de l'océan Indien et au Comores même, parce qu'il y a des circuits de distribution comme les supermarchés et les pharmacies qui ont commencé effectivement à distribuer ces produits, tellement la qualité, la présentation et toutes les garanties de qualité satisfont même la clientèle locale qui est de plus en plus exigeante. Comme tous les consommateurs du monde, la clientèle comorienne est exigeante. On veut s'assurer que le produit ne va pas leur nuire effectivement au niveau de la peau. Et en plus, nous faisons en sorte qu'ils diversifient également la gamme de produits à partir de l'ilang, mais aussi on fait un extrait de girofle, chose que les Comores ne faisaient pas jusqu'à maintenant. On exportait un girofle à l'état brut. Ces jeunes femmes commencent effectivement à faire un extrait d'essence de girofle et à l'utiliser comme intrant dans des produits consommables moyennant packaging et cette certification. Ça, c'est par rapport à ces deux produits. Pour le cas de la vanille, également, nous avons appuyé en termes de packaging pour pouvoir vendre effectivement de la vanille, de l'exporter à l'état brut chez des gros clients en Europe qui vont le transformer de façon industrielle. Nous la proposons, cette vanille, en packaging très présentable à une clientèle touristique locale, les touristes étrangers qui viennent, mais aussi on a des gens de la diaspora quand ils viennent en vacances aux Comores et qui rentrent par exemple en France, qui ont envie d'apporter à leurs amis quelque chose de symbolique de leur pays avec une belle présentation. Nous avons réussi la performance également avec une femme qui a réussi tellement la présentation a été satisfaisante à vendre de la vanille bien présentée dans un packaging dans la plus grande avenue de Tokyo, l'équivalent des Champs-Élysées de Tokyo, avec un distributeur basé dans cet axe assez important de Tokyo. Et tout ça, c'est des initiatives portées par des femmes, et j'en suis très fier. Ils ont été appuyés par le CIR, au point, comme je me rappelle, il y a quelqu'un de la communication du CIR, quand il était venu sur le terrain, pour faire la communication du programme, il était tellement épaté qu'il nous a demandé comment vous identifiez toutes ces bonnes personnes qui sont des succès. Je lui ai dit qu'effectivement, d'abord, nous avons un cadre logique en tant que programme, nous avons des cibles en tant que bénéficiaires. Tant que la personne, effectivement, colle avec ce cadre logique, les priorités, la cible, nous intervenons. C'est vrai que nous sommes un petit pays, nous nous connaissons tous. En tant que coordonnateur, il m'est très facile avec mon équipe quand même d'identifier des initiatives très porteurs par rapport effectivement à la priorité du CIR et du gouvernement d'ailleurs en termes de potentiel d'exploitation et de valeur ajoutée et d'arrimage du pays dans les chaînes de valeur internationales, c'est-à-dire passer de la phase d'exploitation de produits bruts ou semi-bruts à une phase où nous avons des produits vraiment finis, consommables immédiatement sur les étals des supermarchés ou des pharmacies des Comores ou sur des grands axes comme une grande ville comme Tokyo, de trouver un produit comorien avec un packaging qui plaît aux consommateurs japonais, qui est prêt à l'acheter, à le consommer tout de suite, alors que jusqu'à maintenant, ce produit-là, il fallait qu'il passe par des processus industriels, c'est des gros industriels qui le transformaient et qu'on retrouvait, pour le cas de la vanille, nous avons Ushuaïa avec son savon où c'est marqué « vanille des Comores ». Nos jeunes entrepreneurs sont capables de faire exactement la même chose, et d'ailleurs, ils font le savon avec ces essences. Ils sont capables de faire l'équivalent de ce que fait Ushuaïa avec la mention d'indication géographique en disant c'est avec de la vanille des Comores. Ils font même des savons, l'équivalent d'Ushuaïa, qui permet effectivement aux consommateurs comoriens et à d'autres consommateurs de consommer des produits très élaborés, avec une très forte valeur ajoutée, contrairement à ce qui s'est passé par le passé où nous avons exporté des produits assez bruts ou semi-finis.
Merci beaucoup. C'est incroyable. And really, I think we've got two fantastic examples, three with Malawi here. And it sounds like it's not just Lesotho that's maybe on the cusp of an agribusiness revolution in Comoros as well, with exports through to Japan, really looking at adding value to these three key crops. Right, we've had a number of examples, very practical, tangible things that have been here. Stephen, from the World Bank's perspective, Heather mentioned the World Bank earlier. How can countries scale up agribusiness and use agribusiness, use agriculture as a launch pad for industrialization? And what specific country examples can you give us where results are starting to show?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to my colleagues here. I've managed to sort of shorten my presentation and to focus on the 4 or 5 key points, and then backed with some anecdotal evidence as well from experience in Africa over the last 10 years, specifically the last couple of years in East Africa. But prior to that, also having worked on Comoros at one time and understanding the value chain challenges of developing the ylang-ylang industry, where a single producer in the Comoros pretty much controls most of the output and exports, or it did at one time, by putting it, and everything fits on one airplane that eventually flies to Paris through Madagascar, where it's usually held up until it's bailed out by various payments. And so the difficulties of this country to get its products out to markets has been well documented, and they deserve all the sympathy and support. I'll also cover a little bit about Malawi specifics, because we do a lot of work on transformation of the economy there. And that's probably a good way to begin. Most industrialized societies around the world have historically begun as agrarian societies and transformed their agriculture through higher productivity methods and various innovations, moving up the value chains to the point of diversifying their economies and getting into also heavier industries and so on and so on. Now, there's a debate whether or not this can actually work in Africa. It's a huge debate involving many people who think that moving manufacturing from Asia and so on is one method to accelerate industrialization of African countries. And you know, right now in Africa, there are probably 3 or 4, perhaps 5, depending on which countries in the northern parts that you would count as industrialized. And the ones that are industrialized in sub-Saharan Africa usually owe that to the mineral extractive industries and so on. So it's not a really good model for most African countries, which are predominantly agrarian societies today, predominantly populated by poor people in farming areas, and with low skills, and frankly disconnected from much of the world markets by poor access and poor infrastructure, and as well as skills and so on. So a lot of things have sort of lagged behind in terms of development for various reasons, amongst which being policies imposed by governments, but also a sort of a division of labor, if you will, that existed worldwide for decades, formally, informally, whatever. The only examples that I can actually think of industrialization through agribusiness occurs regionally in some countries around the world, even in Europe, where some parts of some countries are much more heavily industrialized because they process. They are basically a factory dense area which processes raw materials from the rest of the country. But what that does is maintain a disparity in incomes and inequitable distribution of wealth, which has always plagued many of these countries, and in fact has often led to conflict where the richer areas no longer wish to subsidize, or at least to share their wealth with others. What we're finding is the same inequalities happening in Africa, where you have, again, a very small middle class, tiny wealthier class, and then predominantly poor producers, poor farmers. And the trade distortions that are largely responsible for, behind these policies, are largely responsible for some of these inequities. So the restrictions on flow of goods, on labor, on capital, and the various price controls that have been introduced over time by governments to control or manipulate, let's say, the income levels of farmers as well as industrialists have produced a lot of this effect, which has retarded development of the rural areas of agriculture and so on, at the benefit of a few larger, let's say, industrial companies, holdings, monopolies in some case, and continuing to perpetuate this over time until the right policies are put in place. Now, in Africa, in the countries where I work, primarily currently in Tanzania, Malawi as well, we are undertaking an approach that does rely on agribusiness production and exports as the pathway to industrialization, much more than relying on infrastructure-intensive, let's say, or let's say energy-intensive industries that may come on stream at some point in the future. Tanzania, for example, has some of the largest reserves of gas that can be deployed at some point in time, but it will be at least a generation or two before there actually is going to be able to enable the creation of industries beyond light manufacturing and, again, agribusiness and so on. In Malawi, we have a transformative project in the Shira Valley, which is a very fertile valley, which is constantly either subject to flooding or to droughts, and produces one good harvest every couple of years. With new irrigation techniques, gravity-fed techniques, we are able to now produce we will be able to produce in the next 3 to 4 years, which is the reason why we are discussing industrialization of Malawi, up to 4 harvests a year, which will produce enormous surplus of different types of goods. It will also free up the energy that is currently used by a large sugar manufacturer, Ilovo, that uses up to 30% of all energy in the country, which will no longer be required to pump water through these irrigation channels, since they will be gravity-fed in the future. So some of the infrastructure issues are hugely transformative. These are public investments in most cases, and that's where the World Bank does come in and intervene in a relevant way, together with the governments. The rest of the solutions are privately driven, of course. Now, it's important that each country have a long-term vision and a strategy to utilize its comparative advantages. The comparative advantages of African countries are enormous amounts of arable land. In some cases, livestock. For example, Tanzania is the third largest, has the third largest endowment of cattle and goats and so on. Ethiopia, Sudan, they're also there. It has a fast-growing population, a youth bulge, if you will. More than half the populations tend to be young people. It has also underdeveloped the participation of women in the workforce. All of these are potential boosters to the gross domestic product of these countries if they can be properly deployed and involved in the economic development. But they tend to dissipate, they tend to melt into the informal sector and into the farming communities. And this is where more inclusiveness is going to be required through these strategies. Now, I'd like to focus on four points, or 5 points, if you will. If we start, let's say, with in the middle, what I would say is central to everything is efficient, accessible markets. I'll explain that. And then all around that is the pillars, or let's say the wheel spokes, that to me represent the necessary ingredients and prerequisites. Now, you can have 8, you can have 10 of these, depending on how you structure them, but for the purposes of today, I'll just focus on 4 and mostly explain 2, the other 2 actually having been addressed to a great extent, but I'll mention them as well. But what I mean by efficient markets, I tend to get down to just a couple of major dimensions, if you will, because each of them can require a lot of discussion. One is information, access to information about supply, demand, pricing, and so on. Now, you could translate that into knowledge, you can translate it into research, intelligence, and so on. All of that is downstream, but it all starts with availability and access to information that can then drive all this. Alongside that is institutional pillars and policies. I'll just mention that separately a little bit later. Accessible markets requires the right trade and investment policies that will enlarge markets, that will actually free up the flows, unimpeded flows of goods, capital, financing, eventually of labor, as we are working in the East African community, to build a single economic space, which is larger than any individual country, but in fact, just like the European Union, with free flow of goods, and capital and land, and labor, I would also add to that, again, information, free flow of information, because the ability to capture information is, of course, what leads to some of the distortion, but also some of the perpetuation of this idea of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and so on, in a certain way. And finally, when I say efficient, accessible markets, I'm talking about consumer societies with hopefully rising incomes. And all this happening in very evolving conditions of urbanization, a huge happening in all the countries, but Tanzania with the high population growth rate, urbanizing rapidly without the necessary infrastructures in place, just like Nigeria where I used to work, and so on. Meaning also that the needs and the demands from the marketplace are constantly changing as people move up the income ladder, but also as tastes and demand for goods change, driven by competition from abroad and by the introduction of new technologies and innovation. What are the four components to the wheel that I would mention is, one is, and this is my own terminology because each of us here can come up with their own, the institutional environment is one. The second one, I called it industry structuring, the structuring of industries. Third would be more on the operational diligence required to be able to develop the transformative effects of the economy, to be able to export and move up the income levels. And finally, of course, there's the catalytic financial ecosystem. So I termed it all, but it's basically the access to financing, primarily from private sources. With an important addition to this is that it has the trickle-down effect to farmers. And you rarely see that feature emphasized, but in fact, I believe those go together. The existence of capital, long-term capital, whether it be credit or investment capital, provided the cascading effect takes place all the way down to the farmer level, both in terms of the cash flows required, the working capital required for them to be able to produce, but also in terms of the cascading of the profits and the wealth down to the lowest level, down to the farmer level. So just to focus on the institutional environment, primarily a couple of things to emphasize. Stable and predictable trade and investment policies are essential that provide access to largest possible markets. Now, those markets can be within a country, they can be regional or global. It doesn't really matter how the lines are drawn, provided that they're erased eventually. In other words, goods have to flow across borders as if they don't exist. And that would be the way to obtain the economies of scale required for efficiency, but also for attraction of additional investments, which will then generate additional compound effects. And these policies have to be aligned with the agricultural development policies and the industrialization development policies and strategies of each country. Very often they're not aligned. They're all sometimes in conflict. And that is where actually our work with the EIF, if I may drop that in, has been so instrumental, because these are the forums where we discuss with authorities and the private sector and all stakeholders the alignment of policies and strategies to be able to create the right access to markets and the right conditions with the least amount of transaction cost. And that can include things like, for example, in Tanzania, local content legislation, local content requirements, the building up of domestic industries in the economy. Also means development of skills and other strategies, and also perhaps the proper use of smart subsidies and incentive schemes if they make sense for the environment. The second one is the streamlined business regulations to lower the cost of doing business. That includes the ease of entry of new business, but also the ease of exiting, so that the assets and the financial resources can be redeployed into more productive use. Also access to land, and also, I would stress, contract enforcement, the rule of law. And this is where I believe it's pertinent to exactly what Roy was saying earlier about productive alliances, but also any kind of vertical business relationships, supply chains, value chains, that are the essence behind the transformation revolution, or let's say hope, aspirations that we have for industrializing Africa. Industry structure, I just mentioned vertical business relationships linking farmers to the end user markets through value chains, through successive, progressive addition of value, which creates jobs and also creates incomes. We use productive alliances as the basis for work in Malawi. In fact, we have a couple of new operations coming up soon. I mentioned to piggyback on the results from Shira Valley, but we also have a commercial agriculture, commercialization, AgCom project that's starting up, and we are preparing another one now to promote export orientation. And this is where the structures also come into play, the necessity to understand the spatial considerations to profit from the agglomeration effects of clustering of industries that are supportive and synergistic with each other. And this is done, and this is where they share infrastructure, they share public services, government-provided services, and also skills and technology exchange takes place in a productive way. We have this approach deployed in many countries around the world, but of course in Africa, most likely you've heard of the Ethiopian examples, in Nigeria where I used to work as well. But in Malawi, we have a study underway to identify the optimal spatial structures for industrial zones and agri-industry parks with the help of the EIF. So an example would be to establish food parks, let's say food production parks in urban areas. You would have clusters more in the regional areas along corridors, trade corridors. And then you would have the agro-industrial parks or estates in more remote areas. For example, the sugar factory next to the plantations and so on and so on. So again, this is what we're working with WTO's EIF.
Steve.
Operational diligence, we're done, huh? Okay. It's already been mentioned in terms of quality control up the value chain and the necessity of tight linkages, which I want to mention requires that contract enforcement requirement. So finally, so the fourth one is the financial ecosystem. Lots of components to that, but I'll skip that unless you have questions about that. Economies of scale, size does matter for markets. Linkages, market-driven linkages, vertical structures of industries. Agglomeration for synergy effects, and then conducive enabling policies. Make it all possibly to produce inclusive and equitable, sustainable, let's say, creation of a middle class, and that middle class will drive industrialization. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. And I'd like to thank you all for your participation here today. We unfortunately don't have time to receive any more questions now. I invite you to contact us directly to continue the conversation. You're welcome to also continue on the social media. We'll direct the questions through to the relevant people. Hashtag EIF Global Forum 2018, hashtag Inclusive Trade for LDCs. But really, once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us in this discussion. I'd like to thank the panelists in particular for the time that they have spent to come and share their experiences with us. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, and I mean, what a rich discussion that was. I think we could have gone on all night. I think we've heard that positive social environmental change through trade is possible. The Body Shop has it in their DNA. We need other multinationals to follow. We've heard that producers need to understand their buyers, and it reminded me of a time in the mid-90s when I was working on foreign direct investment in Poland, and I was taken to go and see some elevators being produced, lifts. And I went to this yard, and I faced a yard that was probably 10 times the size of this room, and there were thousands of elevators. And I said, well, who are these elevators for? And they said, oh, we're sending them to Russia. They build the buildings to fit them. Know your market, be adaptable to it. And in the agricultural sector, we've heard that more value doesn't necessarily equal more processing. It might equal less waste and greater efficiency. These are clearly critical. And alliances are critical too, and trade distortions are damaging. And fundamentally, we need efficient and accessible markets. It's only a very short summary of what we've heard, but it's just such a richness of conversation. So many thanks to all of our distinguished panelists. We have a very short break now. This is not the 15-minute break. This is the 10-minute comfort break before our closing at 4 o'clock. So please scoot outside if you need to. Don't feel you have to if you want to stay, but we'd like to start again at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.